Okay, everybody, welcome. This is the Kubernetes production readiness sub-project meeting for the 23rd of February, 2022. And I think, Wojtek, maybe you've frozen because you're very still.
I see him moving. He's good.
Am I moving now? I was actually stale, so maybe I wasn't frozen.
No, it's my frozen, still frozen for me, but I can hear you. Okay, let me pull up the agenda, which I think is pretty limited right now. Last I looked. And we pushed the retrospective, postmortem, whatever you want to call it, to today because last time only David and I showed up. But without Alana, I think we might want to wait again on that.
I'm willing to go through my recollections while they're still fairly fresh in my mind, and then maybe give Alana a shot in the next meeting.
Sure. Okay. All right, go for it, David. I can try to take notes.
Sure. So, this time there were a lot of reviews. There were more than average. Some of them, it was interesting. They came back around for PRR re-review because it was dropped out of the milestone last release. So that artificially inflated some of the numbers. I think I had maybe 3 that were like that. I think the quality of the PRR that people included had increased significantly, at least in the ones I reviewed. I looked at it, the questions were answered fully and completely. They didn't skip over any of the questions. Usually the troubleshooting, which is what I spent a lot of time reviewing, the directions there were actually quite good, listing out potential failure modes. I only had a few that were like, well, this just won't fail. I think from my perspective, it was a very positive release.
Yeah, I think I have very similar feelings. So it's definitely much better. And I was actually in many cases, or at least some cases, I was looking into history, and it wasn't that in at least in some cases, it wasn't that like it was filled well, but like the actual like the first line approver or SIG approvers or however we call them were doing good job or much better job than in previous releases. Forcing KEP authors to improve that. So yeah, I definitely agree with David here. I think it especially it improved in like the metrics or the monitoring part of the PRR. I think that's where I've seen the biggest improvement, at least in my portion of PRRs. There's one thing, there's one small PR that I opened against the KEP template. Not sure if you had a chance to see that. I know that Alana seen that because she was commenting on that, but I just pasted the link on the chat. Maybe you could take a look. It's basically about like one of the questions regarding the tests, because like many people were telling that like they don't know how to write tests, they don't know what to test, and so on. So I just like added a small comment there with the link to the example PR that was adding some tests for enablement, disablement of the feature gates. So yeah, I think that's mostly my recollection.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. My experience is similar. My biggest issue is that I was personally busy and didn't get to it soon enough. But thankfully, my wonderful team here picked up the slack for me. I'm sorry about that. So I didn't do as much as I would have. I didn't do my share. But yeah, the quality seemed to be pretty good. There's still kind of an issue where often, you know, I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but in the process, like a lot of times I'm looking at like, this isn't even ready for, this is barely ready for SIG approval review, much less PRR type review, right? Like they haven't figured out what they're doing yet. And so, you know, that's normal, I guess, but I don't know if there's anything we would want to do around, we've sort of, on the one hand, it's good to get an early review of PRR in and make sure people are on track with it. On the other hand, like going back and checking 3 times a day for a week and see if, well, you know, because I don't know, that's how I do it, because GitHub notifications don't always work that well for me. So I just set a cycle up where I go and go through my list and check them all and see if anybody's actually added anything. I don't know, it seems a little inefficient, but I guess it's not that big of a deal. Yeah, not much else there. Any actions we want to take?
I have actions I want to discuss separate from a retro, but I don't have any that I want to do related to the retro.
Okay. Well, let me finish this note here and then we can jump into that. Anybody else have any other comments on this from a retro from a not on the PRR team? So we have a couple other folks here who maybe were subject to the reviews, whether any feedback there.
Yeah, it was so smooth, this release. I was really surprised. I was mostly doing PR reviews for duplications and promotions to GA, so it's all quite straightforward PRs. But one that I just observed as a reviewer also was very smooth. I don't know. I was really impressed how everything works, and it felt that like there is a big team of PR reviewers, which I don't know that not the case.
Okay, so I guess some of that is as your experience of working with the PRR team was pretty good. Do you have any?
Yeah, I think this aspect of what you just mentioned, that you need to check periodically whether it's needed for PR review. I had similar, like, mirror experience. I needed to ping Ilana directly to like tell her like it's ready, please take out PR part of it. So maybe some process around that may be helpful. I mean, process is always twofold, right? So on one hand, you improve things, and on the other hand, you introduce more burden, but maybe something that can help and not too heavyweight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm usually asking like CAP authors or CAP approvers from the SIG side to just ping me, and I think that works good for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also do a polling approach. So, you know, it's often, you know, once a day leading up, and then, you know, maybe twice a day when you're really close. And then in that last week, I'll often ping the developers directly on Slack just to make sure they've seen it, because I know GitHub notifications don't work. And so, you know, if you're looking for more than like that, I'll get to it tomorrow. Pinging me is the best way to do that.
Yeah, I'm mostly, I think, just complaining. I don't know if we want to change anything for that, because like Sergey said, like any additional process is more of a headache probably than it's worth. So that's just the nature of open source development, or any development maybe. Okay, awesome. Any other comments before we move on to David's things he wants to talk about, whatever those may be? Okay, take it away.
So, you know, I think most of the people on the call have seen the CAP related to new beta APIs being turned off by default. One of the recommended criteria for that was to update the PRR template to ensure that when transitioning from beta to stable, the KEP author asserts, yes, I have gotten enough real feedback that I believe the feature is stable. And I'm looking for help on, or I believe the API is stable. I'm looking for help on phrasing that. So the way it was described in the KEP review was validate that the feature was reasonably validated in production use cases. That's a little vague if I were to write just that down. Can we crisp up what we really want from a KEP author?
Yeah, so I think I might be the one who suggested this this wording, which I agree is a little bit vague, but I think it's effectively what we want. I don't know how to phrase it better, but I think what we really want is to have some kind of proof that, well, proof is maybe like a big word here, but like to have a belief that like it was actually validated in production. So
do you want to ask about, was this feature tested with X many nodes, or was this feature tested with users who were not able to view the Kubernetes controller manager logs? Was this feature tested with the docs that were provided and not with direct hand-holding or direct guidance from the feature author? Do we want to enumerate things like that? Do we even think we require them logically today?
I think we may not require many of them currently. I mean, I would love to like, wearing my scalability hat, I would love to have like a real production use case in large clusters or large number of objects or whatever. But realistically speaking, I think it's too much for, at least for now. Maybe in the future we will be able to do that. Like, I think what I was thinking about was maybe some kind of like brief description of the setup where it was validated. For example, it was like a GKE cluster in version X, and running like or whatever, like OpenShift cluster or whatever, running in version X, and having like a number of those instances and instances of those objects. And sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a little confused because there's two. So we said, I'm trying to remember here. We said, okay, we're going to turn beta off by default, and then the complaint was, hey, we are. How are we going to get feedback? So we're talking now about when we go from beta to stable. Is that what we're talking about specifically?
Yes. When going from beta to stable, was there sufficient feedback from users in production like environments? And I'm having trouble phrasing the question in a way that I'm going to be able to read the answer and decide whether it's adequate.
Right. So there's different. I think what I'm hearing from, well, what I'm trying to gather is there's different types of feedback, right? There's feedback around the API usability and design, and then there's feedback around the stability of the feature, and there's feedback around the scalability of the feature. So I guess the question is, when do we expect each of those type of feedback to come into play, and who's responsible for making sure that that's been addressed? So I think we had a little discussion about this, Wojtek, on the PR. Like, I don't want us to get into the business of making sure, beyond like early reviews and like really broad problems of making sure that like functionally the API is usable. I don't think we are the right group to do that, and it would just piss people off if we try to. I think that's the API review team and the SIG approvers. Scalability, we definitely have some. We want to make sure, I mean, something's not really production ready if it scales like nowhere near what it needs to. So we've incorporated scalability for sure in what we're doing, and definitely stability is part of it. So I guess I would want to focus, I mean, just trying to think it through, right? I would want to focus the feedback pieces on the stability and possibly the scalability. So that maybe I'm just catching up and that's already what we were talking about, but that's, how do we, how do we ask, like internally, right? We have things like soak time, where we look at, hey, this feature, we've put it out there on our, you know, less stable channels or in a staging environment or whatever it may be, and we run it through these suites of tests, and it's been running there on this many clusters for this long, and we haven't seen any explosions, and we check to see that, you know, some components running on the master nodes aren't all of a sudden consuming massive resources. And so we have like a bunch of criteria. And I'm sure, David, at Red Hat, you have a whole suite of criteria as well. And this is part of our internal production readiness. So how far do we take it in the open source world where we don't have operators? I mean, we do. We're all, there's a bunch of us who are operators, but like, it would be lovely. It would be lovely if we can open source wise get some more of that validation, so that when it does fall into OpenShift or EKS or GKE teams to evaluate it, like all the easy problems or all the obvious problems have been solved. So what does that mean for these questions, I guess? Like soak time, number of clusters, number of, like, I'm not worried about, so sorry, I keep talking, but I'm just thinking aloud. Some of your questions, David, like, has it been used by somebody who doesn't have access to these logs? Like, that I would hope would be resolved before we get where we are today, before we get to production readiness review. So I would probably want to think more on those soak time.
Yeah, I agree. I think I had also the soak time like on my mind when speaking like last time. So I was just trying to not phrase it in a soak time criteria. So I mentioned this, like, let's describe like how it was used in production and like in what cluster, like how long is a good one criteria, like how many objects and stuff like that. Basically to know that like it was really used there. Obviously, like findings, concerns, like problems that it faced, of that's kind of I was implicitly assuming, but instead of like focusing on specific questions, like focus on knowing that it really was used by someone.
So I could use some help in drafting a PR that does it. I'm willing to take a stab at it, but I'm not feeling confident that I can express a question that is easy for someone to understand what we're asking and answer, and easy for us to interpret that answer.
Yeah, I think I also have a concern. There's one concern. I don't know if it's valid, so I'd love your thoughts. Like, as a broad open source project, we don't want to create a criteria that only 3 or 4 or 5 companies in the world could actually give a valid response to, right? Like, only one of the cloud providers or one of the major distribution vendors could possibly sponsor a feature because, you know, they're the only ones who would take the time to pass this gate. That troubles me if we end up in that situation.
Yeah,
I'll
I
try
fully
to
agree. And
I'll try to be careful of that when I craft the draft. So
Okay.
between now and the next meeting, I will try to take what you guys have said and craft a question based on it,
Awesome.
and see if I can solicit a review there.
yeah, I'm afraid that we will not be perfect this time. And I think like after the first release, when this question will be asked, really, we will know better. So I think we just need to prepare for that. Try, like I agree, we should think as hard as possible to make it as useful as or as useful for us or as easy to understand and answer, and as easy for us to interpret that. But I think we will be iterating on this question. I don't think it will be one-time thing.
And this question is not only for beta disabled by default. It's like it's applicable all the time, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I clearly see how, like, we have a feature called pod overhead that we GA in this release, and everybody running with pod overhead enabled. I mean, these fields are there, you can set them up, but we really waited for anybody to at least take a start using it, and we've been hoping for gvisor and Kata, and finally Kata took a set these fields and run it in production, and only after that we GA in this feature, because before that nobody even tried to use this feature fields. So aspect of soak time with this feature present but not being used is past, and then second aspect is somebody actually using the feature also passed. Now we can GA this feature.
Right.
And opposite example is dynamic kubelet config, when everybody running with dynamic kubelet config disabled. But I mean, since we have very little feedback on enabling this feature, we can be deprecating this feature and removing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, yes, it's not just about the beta by default. It's about and it's not just about it's present. It's about it's used, and we have real evidence that it's used. And you know, for major features, for big things like that are sponsored by one of the big contributors, then this is going to be an easy question because it's going to be part of their process. But I worry a little more for small features that have been added by, you know, a smaller company or a smaller set of individuals, how they're gonna do that. I don't want to exclude all of those people from being able to contribute.
Yeah, one feature I remember is 2 Sigma added a feature to change how host name is being represented and on certain distros, and yeah, it was interesting. They probably was the only company that used it when we've been promoting it to beta, and to this day I only know that they were using this feature, nobody else, to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But that actually is less problematic, because they were shepherding this feature and they were using it in production. So kind of like they gathered their that feedback from their own like production cluster. So I think we have more problematic cases that John mentioned, where someone is adding a feature because they yeah, without like having a clear although maybe it's not the case for like the actual full APIs, right? So
well, I think Sergey's point was this isn't just for full APIs. This is if you're going to stable. We're not going to say if an API is going to stable, are we? We're going to say if a feature is going to stable, it has to have some validation. I mean, yeah, I guess the other feature gates are on by default, so in some sense this is a new criteria for them, but it's kind of a false sense of security that it was on by default if nobody used it. I mean, so anyway, let's see what David comes up with, and we'll iterate from there and give it a try. Are there any other topics? I had one thing I wanted to bring up if nobody else has anything else. Let me just take a note here. Minor thing, I just wanted to raise it to everybody's attention that it's that time again. It's coming up on what is it? It's Q1, I think, still. Yeah, it's February. But we probably need to look at our survey again, revise it for the latest releases. And we had some, I think, discussion about, sorry, it's annoying. We had some discussion about like we wanted to be able to measure it in terms of like release n-1, release n-2. So I don't know if that changes the questions or that just changes the analysis. I think that might just change the analysis. But I'm happy to take that on as putting together the survey again and sending it out for everybody to review on this team. And then once it looks good, we can blast it out to the world again. And David did the analysis this last year. Thank you, David. And I did it the year before. Would love to see if there's any other volunteers to jump in, or maybe one of us can do it again since we've done it before. But we can talk about that later.
That sounds good.
Okay. Any other topics, or should we call it a day?
Nothing more from me.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.